You can have autistic traits and not qualify for a diagnosis. That's not a contradiction, it's just about clinical thresholds. Back to our architecture analogy, if your neurotype is the blueprint and your personality is the interior design, the emotional style, then diagnosis is the code that the building instructor uses to decide when a structure meets certain criteria, especially when something might be interfering with safety or function and needs intervention. Diagnosis comes from the medical model, which understands human conditions from the frame of treatment and not necessarily through identity. It's just a classification system. And sometimes those classifications get quite specific. There's literally a billing code for being struck by a duck. Go look it up. And that doesn't mean that being duck struck is an identity. It just means medicine needs a way to categorize different events for the purposes of treatment and billing. That's really how diagnosis is supposed to work. It's about professional communication. It's about having ways of researching certain conditions that need support and treatment. But it's not about defining your entire identity. In order for something to be diagnosed, it needs to fit certain criteria, as well as meet at least one of the 4 Ds of diagnosis: dysfunction, distress, deviance, and danger. And if none of those are going on for a person, chances are they will not meet criteria for a diagnosis. For example, there are loads of people out there with ADHD and autistic traits who don't meet full criteria for a DSM diagnosis. Because of those traits, their lived experience will be more similar to people who would meet criteria for the diagnosis than it might for people who are more neurotypical. Moreover, there are also loads of people who learned to mask their traits so well that even if they were to go get evaluated by a professional today, they may not meet criteria for a diagnosis. And diagnosis, just like building codes, is heavily influenced by cultural norms and the most updated research of its time, which means it can change over time as the science and practice evolve. I'm left-handed. That's part of my neurotype, my blueprint. The majority of the population is right-handed, so technically left-handedness is neurodivergent. But my left-handedness doesn't cause dysfunction, distress, deviance, or danger, so it wouldn't meet criteria for a diagnosis. Historically, though, left-handedness was heavily stigmatized. The Latin word for left is literally sinister. Even a few hundred years ago, left-handedness was seen as a sign from the demonic. It was a deformity, something that needed to be corrected. And like other wiring differences like ADHD and autism, it only becomes a problem when the world is structured in a way that punishes it. When we collapse neurotype, personality, and diagnosis into one category, we either over-pathologize normal variation or we dilute real neurodevelopmental differences. Not every difference is a diagnosis, and the goal isn't to label everything. The goal is to understand people well enough to support them and to build environments where more kinds of minds can thrive.